Hello, I'm Ivan Kerrigan with Tango VC. At Tango, we like to invest in machine learning and robotics startups, and I love interviewing founders working in this space. And today I bring you Delian Asparouhov. I've been working on his Bulgarian pronunciation, so Delian Asparouhov, and he's working at Varda Space Technologies. And what Varda does is build factories in space. Dalian is also a principal at Founders Fund, and they, of course, invested in SpaceX. And Dalian is now moonlighting as both a founder and a VC, which sounds really hard, but it turns out that Founders Fund folks have done it quite a few times. So we talk about what that's like, how you can iterate quickly on hardware, why we should even be building factories in space, how you can build an early stellar team, pun intended, and also how we should get more people working on super hard, ambitious startups. Enjoy. All right, so you have a new company called Varda, and it's really ambitious. So I'd love to hear just right at the start, like what the purpose, the mission, what are you trying to build?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about sort of orbital manufacturing for quite some time. So the motivation behind the company was, somewhat related to how, California became California, which is, we didn't become California via the government paying for, Lewis and Clark to explore. We became California via the gold rush. And that sort of low Earth orbit manufacturing is sort of the equivalent for space, where you can actually significantly accelerate, humanity's path into the stars by commercializing low Earth orbit, as opposed to just having a big spaceship take a bunch of people to Mars. And so that was sort of like, let's say, the sci-fi geek motivation behind starting the company. But the more, let's say, commercial reason to start the company is that there's actually a whole wide array of products that could significantly improve quality of life for people here on Earth that can only be manufactured in microgravity. And so people aren't doing that today because, the idea of making factories in space, sounds kind of crazy. But there's a lot of ways that life on Earth, here would get a lot better if we had factories in space. Everything from cheaper data transmission to, a much greater supply of human organs to, much cheaper, cancer drugs. There's a wide array of sort of use cases and products that can only be manufactured up in space that are useful for people down here on Earth. And nobody's really solving that problem. And I was trying to find a group to invest in and couldn't really find anybody. And so got frustrated enough that I was like, crap, I just got to do this myself or else it's never going to happen.
That's actually kind of interesting. So you are in a position as an investor, and now you're starting a new company. And I've heard you talk a little bit online about how, that keeps you busy. So I guess it's just the most basic on organizing that, and we can talk more about Varda because I have more questions there. But just on that decision to start, it's like, because you're still doing both. And so how do you balance your time? There's like a calendar question here, but there's also like a almost like a hedging question. Like how do you decide to do both and not one full time for, trying to back a great team versus joining the team versus leaving VC and just doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, something that I've mentally tortured myself, for years over, even before starting this company, about like what I would want to do and whether I wanted to go back to being a founder. Because if you ask 19-year-old Dalian, it was always like, I want to be a founder. I want to be a founder. I want to be a founding CEO. And that was what I did when I dropped out of school at 19 and started my first company. And then I took let's say a year-long break working at this company called Teespring. And then the plan after that was I was like, okay, I'm rested up. I'm ready to start another company. And I, somewhat, had this interlude where couldn't quite find the right founding team for the company that I wanted to start. And so Keith basically offered for me to join Coastal Ventures as kind of like somewhere between an EIR, chief of staff, basically learn from him and spend some time basically finding co-founders for that thing. And I kind of had this aha moment about 8 months in or so to Coastal Ventures, where I realized a couple things. One, I'd wanted to do space for a long time, and Coastal Ventures was the way, or venture capital in general was the way to do space immediately, rather than taking what I thought was the only other approach, which is what the Jurvetsons or the Chamaths or the Elons or the Bezoses do, which is you have to make it big in normal tech, and then you can apply that capital to doing space stuff. Instead, I was like, oh my God, I can start funding these space companies today and working on space today, but only in this particular role, because I was like, I'm not ready to found a space company myself at the time, but I'm ready to assess these companies and figure out which ones we should invest in and do that on behalf of Coastal Ventures. And so there's a little bit of this aha moment around, oh my God, I can do space today. But then the second and even bigger aha moment was, I was like, crap, I keep meeting all these founders that are just much better founders and CEOs than I ever was. And I don't think I'm ever going to be a top 1% CEO. And it's mostly comes down to just personality traits, working style. I am an extremely intellectually curious, ADD, bouncing off the walls, don't care much for other people's feelings. And those are all huge pros when you're an investor. And those are all pretty big cons if you want to be a really, really great, CEO. Mm-hmm. And I also just have this thing where I'm just not great at yeah, I can work the 12, 14, 15-hour days when needed. But man, I burn out a lot faster than most really great CEOs do if I need to do that for an extended period of time. And so, yeah, I basically had this realization, that 8-month mark in where I was like, I think like I can be in the top 1% of VCs. And I think I can actually credibly, do that. And it might take me some time, and maybe I won't be, but like at least there's a much better shot than I think honestly being in the top 1% of CEOs. So that was kind of the whole thought process around, okay, maybe I should be sticking in venture, longer term. And then in relation to this particular incubation, yeah, look, Will is just, he's the right CEO for Varda. I am not the right CEO for Varda. You look at him operate, you look at the people that he's recruiting, like he's a recruiting machine. Like we're already up to like 12 people full time. We got the cash in the bank like literally a week ago. And we're talking about like extremely experienced like spacecraft, thermal, like mechanical, mechanics, like all the types of engineers that one would need to build a company like this. Like he has in his Rolodex and as him being CEO, like we are recruiting them like left and right. I would not be able to pull something like that off. Like I know a handful of SpaceX engineers, but it would be, much, much slower process. And at the end of the day, the CEO's primary job sort of is recruiting, right?
Yeah.
And so, a little bit of a saying like, yeah, obviously he's a better CEO for it. For sure, there's a little bit of that like, hey, Dalian, like, aren't you hedging your bets by like, not going all in on Varda, and you still kind of have this backup of like, even if Varda tanks, you still have like the VC career. But like, look, at the end of the day, like if Varda tanks, like, who's going to want to take VC money from the guy who tried to start a company and like, failed at it? Like, it just, my neck is still on the line, either way. And
how do you
then,
split your time? Like how are you deciding like how much to work in what area, like schedule, like where are you? Like if you have to be on site in different places,
Yeah, thankfully, I don't have to reinvent a lot of this stuff from scratch. Like I will say, this is a lot easier doing this 3 years after Endural got incubated at Founders Fund, because I can just go to Trey Stevens, who's the partner that did that, and basically just copy everything. So everything from the company equity structure to the way that our original seed round term sheet with Founders Fund was structured, and how we gave Founders Fund some common, but then also some preferred, like everything, we are just literally copying the Endural playbook. Like actually, if you look at our offer letters, they're literally the same offer letters that Endural gave out to all their early employees. Thankfully, like Matt Grimm, the COO there at Endural, has been incredibly helpful for the past couple weeks in getting everything set up. So thankfully, I'm not reinventing this stuff from scratch. And in particular, this is actually a long conversation that I've had with Trey Stevens around like what he's learned over the past 3 years, basically, doing what I'm doing with, Anduril. And I think a couple of, key lessons that he sort of provided to me. One was, you have to be regularly at the incubation. Like you can't totally do it like remotely. And especially since we're both facing, we're both based in San Francisco, and both the companies that we've incubated are in the LA area. And you can try to do it on an ad hoc basis, but he quickly realized that just didn't work, because then people were like going through all this like, mental gymnastic on figuring out, okay, when is Trey around? When can we schedule with him? Versus what he realized is like, he's just there every Friday. And for sure, sometimes he's there on a Friday and there's not that much Endural stuff for him to do, but he's still there at least, right? And so people know that if they want to schedule in-person time with Trey, they can, do it basically every single Friday. So that's probably lesson one. And then the second lesson is, don't try to segment the days. Like both jobs require you being very, responsive. There's a time where a Founders Fund, portfolio company CEO just like needs to hop on the phone with me that day and discuss a term sheet that they've just got offered. On the flip side, Varda sometimes has things that they really need me for that particular day. You can't do this like magical segmentation between the two. And then, what I'd say is like, I literally just have 2 sets of to-do lists and, inboxes and priorities. And it's literally like at the end of the day, like at Founders Fund, there were times where I could like actually get through the full inbox 0 to-do list, etc. With the 2 jobs, it's now literally impossible, and it's more of a question of like, where can I allocate resources in a way that just like prevents something from like exploding, right? And so right now, for the past, like I will admit, for the past 3-4 months or so in the company formation process and getting things going, of just like, it's kind of, janitorial work, but it's just like making sure that we have like workman's comp insurance and have an office and have desks and are hiring the right people. Like Varda's taken up a lot of my, mental space for the past like 4 or 5 months. But now once we get those hires onboarded, they're taking a lot off my plate, right? We have an IT guy. We have a head of business development in federal. We have a sort of de facto COO type, and they're taking off a lot of those responsibilities. And so I think at that point, it'll start to get a little bit, more evenly balanced. At that point, I'll be doing what it's sort of a VC does best, which is like, I'm just like a really high level sort of like, head of people. I'm great at, strategy. I'm great at fundraising. I'm great at recruiting. And so the way that I think about it is like most of my, contribution to Varda is going to be like, I'll jump into the various, high level customer and like, federal conversations, but we have a guy on the ground that's like a lot better at that than I am, but he'll rope me in when needed. And it's mostly just looking at, okay, what is the recruiting list coming up and where can I sort of help there? Will, the CEO, is going to be a lot better at like, recruiting our, VP of engineering. But, when it comes time for us to have a, CFO or a CRO or things like that, I can, significantly help accelerate, those types of, recruiting campaigns. So
That's
yeah,
excellent.
it's all intermingled. I jump back and forth. Like I'll be on an FF call one time, I'll be on a Varda call sometime, and then also there's the fun ones that are it's actually both, where I'm talking to a space company and I'm like, well, I'm talking to you both from the hat of Varda might want to utilize you, but then also as a FF, I might want to invest in you. And so that's where there's actually synergies between the two. Is like there's actually a lot of times where my time is somewhat dual use. Where I mean, hell, even this interview, right? People are learning about
All
me as an
sides,
investor,
yeah.
but they're also learning about Varda.
Yeah, totally. So going deeper a little bit into Varda, you haven't actually divulged a lot about what you're planning on building in like the details and the timeline. And I'd love to hear a little bit just on the relationships you expect. So if you have like a pharma company that wants to build something, that might be more of like a, hey, we contract with you to go and build this, or maybe you build the robot that can manufacture that kind of material. And or maybe the most profitable path is like, if you're the only person that can supply long carbon nanotubes, then you want to make that yourself, and then you sell that good to others. What do you expect to happen, from like seed to A, like the next year or two, like with these relationships?
Yeah, in the short term, as much as we'd like to be more abstracted and just be like a logistics and factory and be like the quote unquote like Foxconn of space has been the analogy that I like the most. Is like, we're not developing the end product, and hell, we're not even designing the product. We're just like a step in the supply chain. We have the most expertise in how to develop it. Early on, we have to sort of develop that market and sort of like use case ourselves. And so we're being much more involved in the actual basically design of the first product that we're going after, and then also actually leading those customer conversations. But the ideal sort of like medium to long-term application is like, yeah, ideally in the long term when we're starting to work on cancer drugs, let's say, instead you have like a Pfizer that comes to us and says, here's this particular drug, we know that it would benefit from microgravity manufacturing, here's like the design, please manufacture this for us and handle like the supply chain. And ideally then like we're both not designing the product, and then we're also not dealing with like bringing it to the end customer. We're just handed a design, we deal with the basically like microgravity manufacturing, the logistics of that, bringing things back down and then giving it back to that same customer. And so ideally, again, it's like somewhat similar to Foxconn, where Foxconn both their quote unquote supplier, i.e. the person that they're buying iPhone designs from, is Apple, but then they're also selling the iPhones right back to Apple. That's the ideal outcome that we'd like to have, is where both organizations, literally just the same organization that we're both getting the raw materials from and who we're sending them back out to. For the first couple of products, it's not going to look like that. Like we're probably going to have to like really basically almost like make the raw materials ourselves and also figure out the customer. But that's basically just like to spin up basically like the flywheel. Like the quote that I kind of like from Josh Wolf, who sort of joined the board of the company as the head MD at Lux Capital. What he said was, this first product is kind of like our training wheels. Like the whole point is like, the point is not to develop that product. The point is to develop that whole supply chain and then be able to apply that supply chain to a lot of different products. That first product is like, if it's profitable, if it's perfect, in some ways, like doesn't matter, like generate some revenue off of it so you can show it's like commercially viable, but like doesn't really matter like how, perfectly it works.
Yeah, it's interesting when it comes to venture for super deep tech that, let's say your Series A or even B often doesn't have any revenue. But for things that are, some B2B SaaS product, you're definitely judged by, retention and all these other like direct revenue metrics. And where do you think you'll be in that spectrum? Because, the training wheels like prove that you can, ride down the block or in your driveway. Or is it that actually you need to like show the revenue here is very real in order to, because the market kind of is new, clearly, like nobody's doing this. So you kind of have to prove that it exists. Or maybe just like the, robotic manufacturing alone is valuable and that deep tech is how you're going to go. What do you expect? And also my presumption in saying this is that you're gonna have to raise a lot of money. And so just the like what you'll need to do to actually build this is hard. That's some of the context for the question. And so where do you think you are on that spectrum of like revenue, when you need what?
Yeah, thankfully, space factories, as crazy as they sound, are actually a lot less capital intensive than like rockets are. And so, it depends on the, quality of that revenue from that like, initial product, but it's actually like not impossible that like that actually generates enough revenue to like sort of break even on all the R&D within like, sort of $100 to $150 million raised. And so we're not talking about having to raise like, $500+ million in order to get this thing like, really going with a significant amount of revenue. So it's less capital intensive than most projects, but in the grand scheme of things, like we will err a lot closer to like a relativity space where it's like you're raising lots of money before you technically like have any revenue, and it's basically on the promise of like if all this deep tech stuff works, then you end up getting it's sort of like a binary outcome where if it does work, it's actually extremely valuable because basically like nobody else can do this, and so a lot of this is dependent on obviously the investment community's appetite for believing in something like this. Like the reason that like the relativity spaces of the world are able to raise the rounds that they're able to raise is because like SpaceX is showing that like the launch market is quite valuable in terms of like actual revenues. We don't have that same analogy in microgravity manufacturing, right? Like we need to be able to prove that story. If you were to ask me this, 3 or 4 months ago, I'd been like, I think it's going to be like pretty tough. Like I'm kind of crazy and I'm out there and like not many investors are going to be on board with this. Now, having gone through the seed financing, I think I was like maybe a little bit too pessimistic, where I think it turns out like a lot of people have been thinking about this, out there in the ether. And it's also like maybe a lot easier to understand once we actually give a full pitch and walk people through it and actually explain the plans. Like there was a lot more appetite for people investing in Varda than I expected. And maybe that's me being a little, naive or pessimistic or something. But we had a lot of people that were offering, and a lot of people that also would offer in the future that could back this company with very large checks that are interested in seeing this come to fruition. And so I think thankfully in some ways, just off of like the quality of team alone and the hardware, the tech that we're developing, these future financings, I'm not saying there'll be a piece of cake or anything, but we've put together the world-class team across the various both technical and non-technical aspects of the company. Like it's, our ball to fumble at this point. And if we don't fumble, like I think investors will continue to be interested irrespective of like the exact revenue metrics of the company. Like this is not going to be, judged off of that, I think, in the future rounds of financing all the way through probably, series, let's say, D or E. Like I think this company gets to, if it needs to, somewhere between $500 to $750 million total raise until some real scrutiny starts to get put on like, what do these sort of margins look like for these products that you're developing and selling back down on Earth.
Interesting. And when it comes to the manufacturing here, like there's obviously really different kinds of robotics. And people talk about like field robotics that, mobile robots like a self-driving car is a version of that, but drones are too, versus what you see in manufacturing. So, even there are different terms for this. So when you talk about computer vision versus like machine vision, it's like only the manufacturing folks talk about the latter because they kind of have a controlled environment. My presumption is it's more of the latter. Is that correct? Like what kind of automation do you expect? Or maybe it's teleoperation. I don't know.
No, it'll be like largely automated. But yeah, it's funny when people think of space factories, they think like the first question I guess I get asked is like, are there gonna be humans on there? I'm like, oh my god, no. Like that requires so much engineering because like the ISS is not a simple thing to build where you've got like continuous oxygen and you're dealing with like all the needs you have of a human. And then second, they're like, okay, so it's like Boston Robotics style robots like walking around a floor that are like picking things up. And I'm like, oh my god, no. Like when we talk about like factories, it's like there's like 4 motors. And that's about it. And those motors spin at various rates, and there's like various things that get moved very simply. Like the electromechanical processes for most of these things are actually you have to be very precise, Emily, right? These are like high value materials that are somewhat sensitive, etc. But like this is not like robotic arms moving around. This is like motors moving like a pulley or moving like a conveyor type thing, or like some sprayers spraying some coating, or some heaters heating things up. Like these are extremely simple electrical mechanical processes that we're like automating. So yeah, it is like fully automated manufacturing. But again, this is like much simpler than like a Tesla manufacturing line, or honestly 95% of manufacturing lines. Because what you have to realize is it's not like the entire product gets manufactured in space. It's the very particular step that is sensitive to being in space. And so most of the time we have a sort of almost done product and you're just bringing it to space and then finishing it. Or vice versa, you're taking something that's pretty raw materials, you're doing one step of the process and you're bringing it down to Earth. And then the rest of like the final packaging and things and getting it to the end customer happens back down on Earth. And so you have to remember it's like one very particular step typically. So it's like, oh, you like need to specifically spray this coating in microgravity or something like that. Or you need to heat this thing specifically in microgravity. It's not like the entire end-to-end thing like has to happen in microgravity. It's typically just like one very particular step.
I mean, it would be fun to have an orbital dropship that lands in my front yard with an iPhone inside, but probably not the way it's going to work.
For what it's worth, not that far away though either, right? Like we have to start off with this stuff, but like the moment that it works, right? Like the thing about these like markets is like they're just so large. Like if we make it work, we would be with resupplying our factory continuously just with materials, even this automated fashion, we would be consuming more launches than all of the satellite companies combined, right? Like we would basically double the entire launch market within a couple of years if this actually ends up working. And so it isn't actually impossible to say, and I've tweeted this publicly of like, I don't think it's impossible to say that within a decade, we will be producing more semiconductors in space than we are on Earth, and Varda will be the primary producers of those. And obviously, an iPhone is largely a set of semiconductors, all welded together. And so it wouldn't be impossible that, you could see an entire Apple manufacturing line being in orbit, within a decade.
That's incredible. And this actually touches on another thing I want to ask you about, because you have your finger on the pulse here as far as, in planning this company, did you take the launch costs curve and just project it? First off, what do you expect, and what's required, do you think, for launch costs to continue going down, and how's that going to work? Is it just going to be more SpaceX launches and then that comes down, or is there some other dimension on this?
Yeah, on SpaceX's website today, you can book a ride share for a 200 kilogram satellite for $200 kilogram for $1 million, i.e., $5,000 per kilogram to launch. And so we include that in the pro forma, and then in the pro forma that we pitch to investors, it's assuming by 2025 that goes down to $3,000 dollars per kilogram. If I talk to many of my friends that I have that work on Starship, including my literally fraternity brother from MIT that is head of economic performance basically for Starship and is responsible for figuring out how much it's going to cost to launch, he's always delivered on all his various promises. He's been at SpaceX for about 9 years. Sometimes they're a year, maybe sometimes 2 years late, but they always deliver on their promises. He has promised me $50 to $100 per kilogram by 2025.
Wow.
That's much better than what I'm pro-forming right now. And if that ends up coming to fruition, that makes this microgravity manufacturing stuff from difficult to make profitable to extremely easy. And at that point, everybody's mind needs to shift. Because right now, everybody it costs you $1 million to send your satellite to space. So it's crazy to spend less than $1 million, $1.5 million designing it. Because if you spend only $50K and then it fails, it's you lost all this money on the launch. But if it only costs $50K to launch, then all of a sudden you're talking about satellites that are $50,000 to $100,000. And so our ability to send an ISS-sized module up to space as a non-government, non-state entity is very viable in the world of $50 to $100 a kilogram. Now, the way that happens, obviously, I'm not banking entirely on SpaceX. Just look at the number of sort of launch companies that are both, getting into orbit, that are getting significant fundraising rounds, and that are also thinking about the economic costs of this and are marching down towards more and more, reusability. You obviously now have 3, commercial companies that have made it to orbit: SpaceX, Rocket Lab, and now Astra as of 3 weeks ago. I think that number is rapidly going to become 6 or 7 over the course of the next, 18 months. And I think all of those companies are going to continue to be increasing production, slashing costs, and improving the economics. And so even if for some reason, Elon gets hit by a bus and, Starship doesn't end up working out, we're already on this, decreasing cost decay curve, and it is moving far, far faster than Moore's law was. And there's no fundamental physics reason that it should stop. And so, yeah, we're performing $3,000 a kilogram by 2025, but I think it'll be, sort of much, much lower than that, in which case I think a lot more people will be thinking, damn, why didn't I start a microgravity manufacturing company in 2020?
Yeah, regret minimization for you here.
Exactly.
And when it comes to hardware, one of my favorite topics is moving fast in hardware, because it's just so hard. So you have... the way you make something cheap is that you lock in a design and then you manufacture that. And the way you make something good is iterate, depending on how much you know what you want to make. And I know Founders Fund has strong opinions about having a clear vision for the future and just going ahead and building that versus lean startup. But either way, there's a question of iteration that touches on this point of if you have a $50K versus $5 million satellite, how much work you put into that. Look at the way NASA performs. A Mars mission, you have to be very conservative. That's an extreme end of this. So how do you hope to move fast or build a company that can build hardware fast?
Yeah, thankfully, I'd say the average tenure at SpaceX of an employee at Varda is about 6.5 years or something like that. I haven't perfectly calculated with the latest hires. And so thankfully SpaceX knows how to make hardware really, really fast. And so we sort of already have that culture. And I'd say it actually looks in some ways closer to the quote unquote lean startup model, in that you actually typically create hardware iterations rather than trying to design the end product, right? Starship is obviously now the perfect example of this, of just they're just nonstop creating iterations. And the whole point is just don't increase the technical scope too much, because then if it fails, it's not clear what the root cause is. We're starting off with extreme MVPs of our basically space factories, making sure that those sort of MVPs work with the given things, and then basically adding on scope to eventually get the thing sort of ready to launch and ready to go to orbit. And so, yeah, I definitely don't believe in the lean startup model when it comes to thinking about what are you building in the long term and what is your business, and A/B testing towards that. But when it comes to hardware development, the area where a lot of companies, and in particular in space, get screwed is they try to come up with a design on a whiteboard and then perfectly specifically designed towards that. Like that's basically what prevented, Blue Origin from basically ever, getting to orbit, and plenty of other space companies that have sort of, suffered that same downfall. And so, yeah, you have to focus on basically it's like we are, making a piece of hardware every quarter and testing the full system and integrating everything together. And then everybody goes back, and the guys that are working on the reentry thing go back and like they make their next version. The guys that are working on the microgravity manufacturing thing, the guys that are working on the solar panels and the satellite and like the propulsion, they all go back and then reconvene once every 3 months. And it's like, okay, integrate everything together. Let's see how it all works. Okay, this thing failed. Okay, now we know what we need to fix for the next one, and do that on a very, sort of consistent basis. So, yeah, thankfully, if anything, I'm going to be, concerned about this team sort of moving almost too fast, given that speed is sort of in the DNA. I mean, we definitely have gone from, idea to founding team to capital in the bank to, first 12 hires, I think, faster than, probably any space company ever has. So let's make sure not to go to orbit too soon. But yeah, our timelines are only, getting accelerated because it's like, we thought our electrical engineer wasn't going to start for another 3 or 4 months. They're starting on day one in the office with everybody else. So it turns out we can start electrical, design, a little bit faster than we expected.
It's definitely incredible to see like the recent Starship test that exploded and everyone cheering on because they learned what they needed to learn. And so it's like only a company that's focusing on iteration can take the value of that. That's incredible. I guess.
I've been meaning to tweet about like that particular, like let's say like Starship analogy or like how Starship has shifted. Because my buddy is very high up at Starship, and he's been talking about how it's actually been like bending their brains to SpaceX because they've had to all unlearn rockets exploding is bad, right? Because for a long time at SpaceX, if the rocket exploded, that like has almost killed the company many times in the company's lifetime. And Elon with that last test, like he forced the team. He was like, launch. I don't care like how ready you think you are. You're launching today because I need you guys to get accustomed to the fact that we're in like a post-capital world at SpaceX, and like rockets blowing up doesn't matter anymore. I can afford to build 100 of these before we run out of capital. And honestly, we're not going to run out of capital. And so it's really amazing to sort of see that ethos come to fruition, and see also the public start to appreciate this as well. Like this is how large hardware products get done. If you ever read like Loon Shots or any of these books that have been written about these like mega projects and how they work, it's constant hardware iteration and like willingness to have that hardware fail. Designing in a vacuum and just like, designing on a spreadsheet and designing on a whiteboard, it never works. You just got to send things out in the environment on a regular basis. And I'm just, as a space enthusiast and entrepreneur, it is thrilling to see that the public markets and private markets are now willing to make space companies live in a quote unquote like post-capital world. Elon can raise infinite amounts of money for SpaceX, and I don't think people appreciate this. Like all that they've done over the past decade has been done in a pre-capital world. Like they had relatively limited fundraisings. Like some of the fundraisers were really tough. They have raised more in the past like 12 months than they did in the entire company's history before that. And so you think SpaceX has been cool? Imagine what SpaceX is going to be doing now in a post-capital world.
People talk and joke about late stage capitalism, but it actually means like getting to space, becoming a multiplanetary species, and watching some cool rockets take off. And I guess this is a good segue to a final question here, which is how do you get founders to be more ambitious? Because this is maybe just by demonstration. It's like, hey, let's look long term. What is the future you want to live in? But people tend to hedge a little bit. I mean, every employee at like Fang believes they should be focusing on short term income over building the future. But this is how I think about it. Like, how do you get all of this set of founders that would be founders and people what they're starting today to just dial it up to shoot for the world we want to build?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you encourage this is actually just by practice, right? Like the reason that I was more willing to start Varda and dive into it was because I was seeing other financing rounds happen where I was like, whoa, like you can raise a lot more with the level of team that I could recruit than you could 3, 4, 5 years ago. Like Varda couldn't have raised a $9 million seed round out of the gate 5 years ago. No, like I was in the fundraising rounds or like in the fundraising ecosystem as an entrepreneur in 2015. No way. Like zero chance. The only people that got $9 million rounds out of the gate were basically like the Jack Dorseys of the world. I'm no Jack Dorsey, but it's pretty awesome that I can get $9 million, out of the gate for, a pretty damn crazy idea. And so I do think that type of stuff really does encourage sort of like the next generation of entrepreneurs. And the second that I'd say is like, I do actually think that this stuff is starting to shift. Like I'm probably more optimistic about company formation than I have been in a while. I mean, if you just look at the, sort of macro US stats, more new businesses were formed in 2020 in the United States than like in the past decade, basically, in terms of if you annualize it on a per year basis. And so it's great seeing that. And then also just like the oversupply of capital is now starting to shift people's mindsets of just like, if you were an early employee at, let's say the equivalent of something like Stripe in 2015, you maybe got financed, but it wasn't like a guarantee. Man, if you're an early employee at like Stripe, Anduril, like, any of the sort of, Snowflake, et cetera, of the world that are like promising companies in 2020, it almost like doesn't matter what your idea is. Like, you get to raise $3 or $4 million out of the gate if you worked at one of those companies. And so I just think that like people are starting to see that like the bar has been lowered for both like, quality of team, quality of idea, et cetera, to get a really solid, like, I mean, again, back in, 2009, 3 or 4 million would have been called the Series A for $3 or $4 million. And I also just think that actually it's just like increasing the success rate of these companies too, because just like way more capital is afforded to them that allows them to continue to progress. And also just like the quality of just like, startup advice, the number of mentors that you can have, the number of VCs that are out there, just like only, continue to increase over the time that I've been in Silicon Valley. And so, yeah, I think, you just keep inspiring people by, doing and being like the example. Like, I am sure that a lot more of my like friends are now thinking like, whoa, like Dalian wasn't like 10 years at SpaceX or something like that, and he's starting a space company. Like, maybe I can also go start a space company. And the overlap between those two worlds is definitely getting a lot tighter. Like, it used to be like space and Silicon Valley were kind of almost like two separate areas, and they have been for a while. I'm seeing so much more overlap. Like, I just had a close, friend, Julia DeWall, who used to be the chief of staff at Opendoor and has, was an early employee there and had a, ton of different roles there, just joined as one of the early business hires at Starlink. And that was one of my first, like, aha, where I was like, whoa, like, I categorized her as Silicon Valley world. I never thought she would overlap in a space world. And now all of a sudden those, like, worlds are starting to bleed together. And I think that gets people a lot more comfortable because it's just like, you just learn a lot more about, okay, here's what people are working on in space. Here's the type of companies that I could start, basically.
That's incredibly exciting, and I look forward to seeing what all the founders build and what Varda has in the future. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Sweet. Thanks, Ivan.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. Thanks again to Dalian. And if you like this, please share it with your friends and subscribe down below on YouTube, and also head over to Tango VC for more. Thank you.